Hello and welcome to We Caribbean, a special program in which we discuss and analyze the issues affecting the region, giving a voice to those who are impacted. It's their issues, their concerns, their triumphs on We Caribbean. I'm your host, Doris Polo. So Guyana is set to have a national recount of the disputed March 2nd general elections beginning Wednesday, May 6th. The 25-day recount will be scrutinized by a three-member Caribbean community team, which includes two electoral experts from Antigua and Barbuda and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They would be allowed to seek clarifications from the 10 working stations, express opinions, or be asked to express opinions. And there have been grave concerns surrounding the polls, which saw 480,000 people cast their ballot for their party of choice. The results were challenged after both the ruling A Partnership for National Unity and opposition People's Progressive Party Civic declared themselves the winner of Region 4. So for more on this, we're joined by Lalu Hanuman, attorney at law and former chairperson of the Barbados Lawyers Association Human Rights Committee, Peter Wickham, director of the Caribbean Development Research Services, and Captain Gerald Govaya, chairman of Guyana's private sector group. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
So, Peter, my first question will be to you. It's 2 months after Guyana's general elections, and we know that you did a poll to really ascertain which political party would have been in the lead and which one was not. How would you say these results, though disputed, measured up with what you found in your research?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've actually addressed recently. I mean, and let's be clear, the poll would have been done over a year ago. Certainly the poll was done right after the vote of no confidence. It showed that there had been a percentage swing of 1% in favor of the APNU, the APNU grouping. In this business, a 1 percentage point swing is neither here nor there. And certainly I would like to think that in a year that could easily have been reversed. So my professional opinion is that a poll at this time, a poll taken then is entirely useless. But for what it is worth, that poll would have suggested that the outcome is similar to what the APNU group is suggesting has happened. So in fairness to them, the poll, if the year had made no difference, the poll essentially would be saying that they had a 1% swing that they needed to win. Just a small clarification though, the PPP Civic is not claiming that they won Region 4. What they're claiming is that they did well enough in Region 4 to win the election. So going into Region 4, the lead was significant enough that had they been able to gain a similar level of support in Region 4, not necessarily win it, they would still win the election. So they can lose Region 4 and still win the election, and that's essentially what they're saying has happened.
Thank you so much for that clarification, because we have seen that for the other polls, for the majority of the other polls, the PPPC was in the lead, and it was by a very large margin. I would like to go back to the initial vote count following the elections. Jerry, we heard you say that the last leg of the ballot counting saw GCOM officials go into a back room in the absence of any observers, and we heard claims from some reporters that the vote rigging had been happening in plain sight in slow motion. Can you tell us what you observed?
Well, first of all, I want to make it very clear that this is not a complicated process. This is not a computerized process. This is actually a very, very simple process. It's a process of taking the statements of poll that is completed after every ballot box is counted. So the statements of poll reflect what is in the ballot box. And this was a very simple process where the returning officer is meant to take the statement of poll, show it to everybody, and then call the numbers out on the statement of poll, and then those numbers are inserted into Excel spreadsheet and populate that spreadsheet. Very, very simple. There's nothing complicated about this. The thing about it is a transparency issue, so it's supposed to be done in front of the party and in front of the stakeholders, and they confirm the numbers that is populating the database, and at the end of the exercise, everybody will agree on the tabulation and the number that happened at the bottom of it. So it's a simple process. And so what they were doing, basically, they were calling out numbers from this spreadsheet that had no relevance to the and no connection to the actual statements of poll. Because the statements of poll, there were pictures taken on every polling station, was posted on doors. People had copies of it that was given to them in the polling stations. And it was just the most transparent rigging you'll ever see in your life, if there was such a thing. It was the most transparent, barefaced, brutal, and disrespectful rigging that you'll ever see in your life. And I could tell you that's what I saw up to that point in time. It got worse. In another 2 or 3 days, it got worse. The Chief Justice, the matter was taken to the court ruled, and the court vitiated what he did. The court instructed him to go back and do it correctly, the way that Lowenfien had said it should be done. The court instructed him, the judge showed him how to do it and said, go back and do it. He came back in the room and he started doing it wrong. He started doing what he was doing in the first place. Started reading from a spreadsheet again. He did not obey the judge. And by this time, what they were doing is racing through. They were calling it and they were racing through the numbers to try to get it to the end. And by the time the lawyers moved to the court to file contempt of court charges against him, he had done like maybe, I would say, 80% of Region 4. And
Lalo, based on what we just heard Jerry describe, we know that there were a lot of protests following that particular incident that he's describing there, specifically PPPC protesters, and then some of them were arrested, as well as we've heard reports that police used tear gas against some of them. How would you describe that development, and would you say that that was some sort of human rights violation against these protesters?
Well, from the very beginning, it must be said that democracy is one of the universal core values and principles of the United Nations. Respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the principle of holding periodic and genuine elections by universal suffrage are essential elements of democracy. And clearly what Mr. Gavaya described there, and he used the term transparent rigging, which is a very interesting oxymoron, it says it all. In terms of what happened subsequently, it was predictable. Guyana is a very highly charged, fragile ethnic society, divided almost equally in terms of the two major races between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. I believe there's Afro-Guyanese are something like 30% of the population or thereabouts. The Indo-Guyanese are about 40% of the population. And the remaining 30% are Amerindians and Portuguese and Chinese and people of mixed race. Yes, Mr. Gavaya is one of the Portuguese. So it was predictable that it would turn into an ethnic confrontation. And in the context of Guyana, the so-called disciplined forces, which are the police and the military, are drawn mainly from the Afro-Guyanese sections of society. Really, I mean, to use a Marxist sort of analysis, in the context of Guyana, and this goes all the way back to the days of colonialism, the Afro-Guyanese are the proletariat, and the Indo-Guyanese are the peasantry. The Indo-Guyanese live in the rural areas mainly, and the Afro-Guyanese live mainly in the cities or the urban areas. So it's an urban-rural divide as well. So yes, there were protests on the blocking of roads and the setting up of barricades, burning tires and so on, stopping approaches into Georgetown by the Indo-Guyanese community who are, as I said, in the rural areas. It degenerated with an attack on a school bus with children. There's a school bus. It's called the David school bus, named after David Granger, the president. And it was attacked with stones, which is totally and absolutely unacceptable. But the police then retaliated. 2 people were shot. 1 person died from gunshot wounds fired by the police. And as you mentioned, there was tear gassing as well. But given the fragility of the ethnic reality in Guyana, anybody who does what has been done in Guyana, this transparent rigging, again, to use Mr. Gavaya's oxymoron, knows that these will be the consequences. So the APNU AFC people know very well that they're playing with a very dangerous scenario by doing what they're doing, but they're happy to continue because they're obsessed with power.
Thank you so much for that insight, Lalo. And with that, we will take a short break. And when we come back, we'll have more on the developments relating to Guyana's elections. Stay with us. Welcome back. So, Peter, we will continue this discussion with you. This incident, this political crisis in Guyana, all started with a no-confidence motion that was passed in the government in December 2018 and then upheld by the Caribbean Court of Justice in June 2019. Has the government managed to evade these constitutional and legal declarations to continue ruling?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. Suffice to say, they have. The first, and I think the most critical point was that the vote of no confidence was valid. And based on the vote of no confidence, Parliament should have been dissolved and election called within 3 months. I think that was the timeline that was given. The court essentially said that that would be the case, but they also refused to impose any penalties or to essentially identify a date. The GCOM got pretty close to the date that was being proposed, but it wasn't within the 3-month period. And I guess this was a sense of moral victory for the government, because the government was arguing from the beginning that the vote of no confidence was invalid. Based on the results of my poll, my feeling was that if they had gone to the people immediately, they probably would have won a victory in that instance. Not a clear victory, but they would have essentially have been returned. Because let's face it, at that time, the PDP Civic was also not ready. They hadn't identified a presidential candidate. For several reasons, they were not ready to do battle politically. So we had the legal machinations over the course of a year. And both sides were claiming victory at different points in time. There was questions as to whether the list was ready. GCOM finally set a date and said, okay, we're ready by this date. The election was called, and now we have the election. You saw the president essentially taking a position that appeared to support the idea of a recount. And then Yulita Moore, who is a candidate of the ACNUR group, going forward and saying that she was objecting on legal grounds, and she brought a legal challenge, which didn't succeed, saying that GCOM could not do it. And that was something that was difficult to understand. And then in all of this, the AFC side is expressing views that they are comfortable with the idea of power sharing. But ultimately, you have the rules of the game that are fixed going in. You agree to those rules, and ultimately you cannot now come to a point of where you're saying, but we understand the results are likely to be this, but let's say if we can have power sharing. So there's all kind of confusing signals going around.
Both the ruling Alliance for Change Party and People's Progressive Party Civic hope to govern the country, as Peter just mentioned, as there's a very real prospect that oil revenues in the next decade could make Guyana one of the wealthiest nations in the hemisphere. How, Jerry, would you say has this deadlock affected the private sector?
It is devastating. It is absolutely devastating. And it's compounded by the COVID-19. But we are probably, I don't know, you guys corrected me just now, but I don't know if there's any other country in the world that is in such a position at the moment where this COVID-19 is wreaking havoc in our country, and we don't have a legitimate government that is sitting there leading the process, rallying people. But I just wanted to quickly say to you that I heard the insertion of race. And I want to say to you that in 2020, and in fact, starting from 2015, the coalition won the elections based on a big tent. So this was no longer just a black party or an Indian party. This was parties that were talking about having Indian supporters, Portuguese supporters, Armenian supporters, and none of these parties, mind you, could win an election only with black votes or only with Indian votes. So that they have to be able to win the confidence of other races. And in fact, if you listen to the coalition talked about a big tent. The coalition boasted a lot about the Amerindians and the Portuguese and the East Indians that were part of their party. And the PPP also went to great lengths to also attract people from other races. So these elections were about issues. They were not about race. Throughout this exercise, I watched both of these big parties really did an excellent, the campaign were excellent. It was well organized. Their messaging was good. And they were out there dealing with issues. This was not about race. And so I was quite shocked. I was quite shocked when race started to be injected into this process. And a couple of days ago, I stumbled on a program like this where some intellectuals were talking about this issue of power sharing. And I say that when I went to vote, nowhere on that ballot paper had any place for me to tick mark about National Front government. It had parties, and I had to choose those parties, and that is what we did as a nation. And a government must be formed by winning a fair and free elections in a democratic, transparent way. And what we need to solve this problem is politicians who respect the Constitution, respect the rule of law, and respect the court rulings. And all our problems will go away. And I just will end by saying this. And I've heard people talk about the fact that this oil is maybe part of the problem. But I will say to you, I don't share that view. I share the view that the PPP and the PNC have always rivaled themselves to power, even when we were still selling cassava bread. So even when we were still selling cassava bread and we went to elections, it was rivalry. It was political rivalry. It had nothing to do with oil. And these elections is exactly the same thing. This is a political, malicious thing that they're doing.
Peter, we know you have a response.
Very, very, very quickly. My thing is that the stakes are higher in this election than ever before. And I think that the stakes being this high have a lot to do with the fact that we're seeing these machinations. I'm familiar with elections over the past years. And I mean, usually the way that people will try to give themselves an edge is by stuffing a ballot box or alternatively voter padding. These are the things that have historically been done in the region. Guyana is familiar with the ballot box stuffing allegations, I should say. And the voter padding is something that comes up all the time. But this stuff that's happened in Guyana where the statement of polls were ignored, this is new, this is different, and I find it's pretty crass. That tells me that there is something at stake in this election that is unique. And for that reason, the powers on both sides have a vested interest in hanging on. And definitely, I think that the reality of the APNU tells me that, look, the stakes are pretty high here, and for this reason, you need to hold on pretty tight. So I think that the oil is a factor. The oil has exacerbated the situation and has made the need to remain in office significant. Because what I'm sensing is that the supporters on both sides are saying, you can't let this one go, because it means that for the next 20 years, whoever is there is probably going to stay there with an extremely financed governmental machinery, that you cannot allow that not to be put at your own disposal to help the people who support you. And that's my sense.
Yeah. Lalu, my question to you, based on what we've heard Peter and Jerry saying, they've both technically disagreed on the same topic. So I would like to get your take.
Okay, just to respond briefly to what both Mr. Gavai and Mr. Wickham said. Guyana's had a history of rigged elections going all the way back to the 60s. It's all been well documented. The BBC, in fact, we can find it all online. The BBC did 2 World in Action documentaries for the 1968 and the 1973 elections. In those days, we used to have what's called overseas voting. And it was shown that most of the people who took part in the overseas voting never existed. Even horses in a field in Britain were listed as voters in the Guyana's election in 1968. And it's all online. You can Google it and find it all there. And in reality, the PNC, and this is a PNC government, because APNU is just a front for the PNC. The PNC is the biggest single entity. But I take Jerry Gavai's point that with the AFC joined on to them, they created a bigger tent, and which transcended race. But the PNC was the creation, in effect, of the CIA and the British to keep Jenny Jackins about Marxist policies out of government, because both the Americans and the British back in the 50s and the 60s were concerned that Guyana would become a Soviet base. So they created the PNC, and it's all online. It's all there. The American State Department, after a period of years, I think it's 40 years, they released some documents. But the documents are redacted in places, but it's all there. Anybody can source it online. And in fact, the documents show that until the 1970s, the American CIA was actually funding the PNC. They are actually acquiesced in the rigging. The PNC has never won any free and fair election in its entire existence. It only managed to buy a coalition process back in 1964 and again in 2015, but not on its own. And it never can, because it's held in such disrepute. Everybody who's lived through the period that Jerry Gavai mentioned in the 70s and 80s in Guyana, the deprivations, the murders, including of Dr. Walter Rodney, and this is, by the way, the 40th anniversary of his death this year. Next month, the 13th of June, is the 40th anniversary of Walter Rodney's death. There was a commission of inquiry, a presidential commission of inquiry, which found that Burnham was directly implicated in his murder. It was a horrendous period of time. There was this group called the House of Israel, which were synonymous almost with the Papadox Tom Mokuts that used to go around intimidating and beating and murdering people in Guyana. But I believe that the reason why, in particular, they lost the 2020 election is because of the same reason that Donald Ramotar, the previous president, lost that election in 2015, because of their contempt for the people in Guyana. Had they accepted the no confidence vote and gone to elections, I think as Mr. Wickham, his findings found, they would have won the election, no doubt. But they started with all this foolish antics saying that 33 votes is less than 32 votes. You know, any little child in a primary school will know that 33 is more than 32, but yet they were arguing that 32 is more than 33. Therefore, it wasn't a valid no confidence vote. And all kinds of foolishness, and it dragged the whole matter out for so long, just like Donald Ramotar back in 2015 with his proroguing of Parliament to avoid the no confidence vote, which was legal, which was constitutional, but it was contemptuous of the democratic process. And I think that is why he lost that election, or the PVP lost the election in 2015, and this is why the PNC, in effect, lost the election in 2020. Coupled to which, a lot of people are disillusioned at the incapability of the APNU AFC people to negotiate. They negotiated a very foolish, simplistic oil deal with Exxon, such that they get something like 2% revenues after all of Exxon's debts going back 20 years have been paid for, whereas places like Brazil get 60%, Ghana and Africa get 10%, and Guyana gets 2%. I mean, it's totally ridiculous.
Unfortunately, guys, we are running out of time, so I have a final question to all of you. I would like to ask, what sort of role will international observers have in this upcoming recon process, and what can we expect to see happen? And your final thoughts, starting with you, Peter.
I think that they should have a major role. I would like the international community to have a supervisory role. I think that that's Guyana's only hope for a free and fair outcome for this election. As to the reality, I would be very surprised if they're allowed to do anything other than watch and complain, which is essentially what the observers have been reduced to at this stage.
Jerry?
Let me just say that we are in big trouble. As I sit here this afternoon at 2:30 on Monday, we are in big, big trouble because the Carter Center, a 767 was started to bring in the Carter Center and the Republican Institute observers. They were in Miami, they were waiting there. And the US government, the Canadian government, the United Nations pleaded with the government of Guyana to allow them to come, and the Guyana government did not allow them to come. So the plane left empty from Miami at 9:30 this morning. It's probably landing here in Guyana now empty without the observers. This to me is the most atrocious and crazy thing I've ever heard in my life. We've allowed the Caribbean observers to come in with a chartered flight. We've allowed ExxonMobil to bring a 777 into Guyana with hundreds of their employees, but we could not allow the Carter Center and the Republican Institute to bring their observers. I think you're looking at 10 people on this 767 that was coming here to observe the count that is starting on Wednesday. Now, what has compounded that fact is that CARICOM, while the Prime Minister of Barbados has been amazing. I mean, if there's any time Guyana need CARICOM is now, guys. We really need CARICOM to rally around our democracy and the preservation and protection of democracy. Unfortunately, they were only able to send 3 persons to Guyana. The odds are against us.
Yeah.
The riggers that rigged these elections in March are still here.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very worried without the kind of international backup systems to watch what is happening, we are going to be in big trouble.
And Olalu, your final and closing comment.
Well, I endorse what the other speakers have said, but I notice as well that the APNU AFC people, the PNC in effect, are saying that people should even have their mobile phones with them at the count because they're concerned that people will do filming of what's happening. And what has changed in terms of the recent elections in Guyana is that people now have mobile phone technology. And particularly in terms of this election, The world has become aware of all the crookery and the transparent rigging, again, to use Mr. Gavaya's term, because of the mobile phones. Because the mobile phones, they speak louder than words coming from any political camp. People can see what's happening. There was a situation at one of the count centers where the riot police were brought in, and the observers who were protecting the ballot boxes, making sure they're not tampered with, were ordered out. And all of that was captured on film on people's mobile phones. Now they're saying they don't want people to be allowed with mobile phones in there because they don't want any filming. It's grotesque. It's complete negation of what democracy is about or should be about.
Thank you so much, Lalu. And with that, we have reached the end of this edition of We Caribbean. We would like to thank our three guests today, Lalu Hanuman, attorney at law and former chairperson of the Barbados Lawyers Association Human Rights Committee, Peter Wickham, a friend to Telesur and director of the Caribbean Development Research Services, and Captain Gerald Govaya, chairman of Guyana's private sector group for Telesur English. I am Doris Polo. Thank you for joining us this week.